"Are you the angel Papa prayed for?" whispered the small boy clinging to her skirt. The coffee had gone cold again. I noticed it the way I noticed most things that autumn, too late, and without the will to do anything about it. The cup was sitting on the corner of the workbench where I'd set it 3 hours back, before the north pasture fence pulled me out into the dark before sunrise, and now the light coming through the barn door was the flat gray of mid-morning, and the coffee was cold, and I drank it anyway. Stone cold, bitter, the way bad coffee gets when it sits on iron too long. I drank it because throwing it out felt like one more small surrender I couldn't afford. Cal was in the house. I could see the lamp on in the kitchen window from where I stood in the barn doorway. He'd been up since before me. I heard him at some point in the night, his bare feet on the board floor overhead, moving toward the window and then back, and I lay in the dark and didn't get up because I didn't know what to say to him anymore, and that was the whole truth of it, laid flat. My boy was 6 years old, and I didn't know what to say to him. Elsa had known. Elsa always knew, not in any mystical sense, just in the way a good mother knows her own child, knows what he needs and when and how to give it without making a ceremony of it. She'd know what to say in the morning before words were needed. She'd know what he needed at night. She'd sit with him and she'd listen and he'd feel heard, and it looked effortless when she did it, which meant I'd never had to think much about how it worked. Now I thought about it. I thought about it constantly, the way you study a lock after the key is gone. I set the cup down and picked up the hoof pick and went back to what I'd been doing, which was not much. The roan mare stood patient in her stall, her weight shifted to 3 legs, her ears soft. I worked around her left rear without talking to her the way I used to, just the sound of the pick working, and the smell of the stall, and outside the wind picking up a little from the northwest. It was late October, and the cold had real teeth in it now. Not the polite hint of autumn cold of September, but the kind that meant business. The alternative to the barn was the house and the lamp and Cal eating whatever he'd found to eat, because I hadn't made him breakfast. Again. The bread was where it always was. He was old enough to cut himself a piece and find the jar of preserves on the low shelf. He did it without being told. He was 6 years old and he managed his own breakfast because his father hadn't gotten there yet. I was not doing well. I want to be plain about that, because the story sounds a certain way from the outside and I don't want you to hear it wrong. A man can tell himself a lot of things in the dark, that he's holding on, that he's managing, that grief is just a season and seasons turn. I told myself all of it. I said the words to myself in the barn at night the way you'd say a prayer if you still had the faith to pray. Not because they were true, but because saying them was the only way to get through till morning. But the truth you can't outrun is the one your 6-year-old sees on your face. It's there in the morning when you come in from the barn, the emptiness behind your eyes, and Cal saw it. He'd learned to read me the way children learn to read the weather. You know what's coming before it arrives. You adjust yourself accordingly. I didn't like that he'd learned that. I didn't like what it meant about the kind of father I'd been in those months. Elsa had been gone 14 months. I'd done the arithmetic on that more times than I could count. 14 months, which was 60-some weeks, which was most of Cal's memory of what life had felt like before. He'd been 4 when she went. He remembered her enough, the important things. The way she sang while she cooked, off-key and not caring. The way she knew how to whistle loud, 2 fingers in her teeth, which had spent half the summer trying to learn and hadn't managed. The smell of her, which he told me once he was forgetting, and that was the worst thing he'd said to me in the whole 14 months. I'd told him we'd get something of hers. A scarf, something she'd worn. He could keep it near him. He'd looked at me very carefully when I said it, checking whether I could hold that conversation, and I had held it just barely, and then I'd gone out to the barn. I'd hired a woman from town, Mrs. Aldrich, a widow herself, broad and capable and kind in the way practical people are kind. No fuss about it, just decent, to come out 3 days a week and see to Cal and the cooking. That had lasted until August. Her daughter in Cheyenne had needed her, some trouble with the daughter's husband, and Mrs. Aldrich had packed and gone, and I'd said I'd find someone else, and I hadn't. 2 months back, that was. I was cooking when I cooked, and Cal was eating bread and cold beans more than a boy ought to, and I knew it the same way I knew the fence line in the north pasture was losing posts, clearly, precisely, without the will to get to it. I hadn't prayed in a long time. I want to say that too before I get to the part about Cal. I used to. Elsa and I both did, the way people do when they're young enough that the world still feels like something that can be reasoned with, bargained with, talked to. We prayed over meals and at night, and sometimes just in the middle of the day when something struck us, something we were grateful for. I prayed hard the week she was sick, the fever week, the long, terrible week of it, the way I imagine men pray in the moment before a charge, when there's nothing left to do with the fear. I prayed until she died, and then I stopped. Not in anger, exactly. Not shaking my fist at the sky the way men do in stories. More like a man who's been talking into an empty room for long enough that he finally just runs dry. The energy required is the same whether anyone's listening or not, and I didn't have the energy. But Cal had kept praying. 6 years old, and he still knelt beside his bed at night the way Elsa had taught him. He still said the words, or his version of the words, which were not entirely the words she'd taught him. He'd edited them, the way children edit things they're given, to reflect their actual situation. He prayed for the horses by name. He prayed for Mrs. Aldrich by name even after she'd gone to Cheyenne. He prayed for me, which did something to my chest I don't have a word for, something that sat between gratitude and grief, so close to both that I couldn't separate them. And somewhere in those autumn months, he started praying for a woman to come. Not in those words, he was 6, his phrasing was his own. He said, and I'm giving you his exact words because I was in the hall and I heard them through the door one night in October, flat on the other side of the wood listening to my boy in the lamplight. Please send Papa someone who's kind. He needs someone kind. I went to the bunkhouse side of the barn and stood there in the dark for a while. He was 6 years old, and he was praying for his father the way you pray for someone who doesn't know enough to pray for himself. She came on a Thursday. I didn't see her arrive. I was down at the creek clearing a jam of deadfall that had backed up the water and was threatening the lower field. It was the kind of work that takes longer than it should because the wood is cold, wet, and heavier than it looks, and your hands go numb by midway through. And when I came back to the yard late in the afternoon, there was a horse I didn't recognize tied at the post. A solid bay, trail dirty, good feet, calm eye. She'd been ridden a distance. The saddle was a plain working saddle with a bedroll strapped behind, worn leather, well maintained. I stood in the yard and looked at the horse for a moment before I went inside. Cal was sitting at the kitchen table. Across from him sat a woman I had never seen. She was perhaps 40, brown-haired, plain-featured in the good sense. Her face was the kind that had been weathered into itself, nothing soft or arranged about it, just what it was. She was straight-backed in the chair the way some women are who have spent real time in hard country and learned that good posture is a form of self-respect you can maintain even when nothing else is going right. She had a travel coat still on. She was looking at Cal with the particular attention of someone who was actually listening, not just waiting. There was a cup of tea in front of her that Cal had made. He'd found Elsa's tin on the high shelf, the shelf that required a stool, and he'd gotten down the tea and boiled the water and made this woman a cup. She looked up when I came in. "Mr. Holt," she said. Not a question, she knew who I was. "I'm sorry to come in without invitation. Your boy let me in. I'm Nora Vane. I'm the school teacher the county hired for the Ridge Creek district. I was told at the Dobbins place that you might have a room to board while I find my footing here." I looked at Cal. He was watching me with that careful, weather-reading look. "Who told you to try here?" I said. "A man named Garrett at the feed store in town. He said you'd had a boarder and might want another." I told Garrett that in passing, months ago, One of those conversations you have at the counter while your order's being pulled and then forget entirely. I'd forgotten I said it. I looked at the woman. She was watching me without the nervous performance most people put on when they want something. She wasn't making herself pleasant. She just sat there and let me look. "The room's not much," I said. "I've had less," she said. I told her she could stay through the week while we worked out terms. She thanked me without making a production of it, and that was that. The first thing I noticed about her was that she was quiet in the mornings. Most people who board in a working house feel they have to earn their keep conversationally, fill the air, make themselves agreeable, show they're not a burden. Nora Vane came down in the morning and made coffee and stood at the window looking out at the yard, and she didn't say anything unless I said something first. She drank her first cup standing up, looking at the yard and the barn and the ridge behind it, just taking the measure of where she was. And it was not an anxious quiet, not the quiet of someone composing themselves or holding something back. It was just the quiet of someone who didn't need to talk until she had something worth saying. Elsa had been like that. Not cold, neither of them were cold, just comfortable with silence in the way that means you can share a room without it being a performance. I found I could breathe easier in the mornings. Cal took to her the first morning. He came down and she was at the window and he climbed up onto the chair beside her, which put him level enough to see out, and he stood there looking at the yard too without saying anything for a moment. Then he said, "That's Cora, the roan. She's nice but she doesn't like strangers touching her ears." Nora Vane said, "Good to know." She didn't make a fuss of him, she just acknowledged the information. He said, "Papa lets me brush her sometimes." She said, "Does she like being brushed?" He thought about it. "I think so, she does this thing with her lip." "They do that," Nora said, "when it feels good." He nodded, satisfied. They stood there together at the window for another minute, and then Cal jumped down and went to put his boots on. But something had been established between them that morning, something quiet and mutual, and I watched it happen from the stove and didn't say anything about it. She started teaching at the Ridge Creek schoolhouse the following Monday. She was gone most of the day. The ride was 20 minutes each way, longer in bad weather, and she came back in the afternoons with chalk on her sleeves and that particular tiredness that comes from a day of managing children, which is a specific kind of tired, not physical but something deeper. The first evening she was back from school she looked at what was in the larder. She didn't ask permission. She opened the cabinet and looked at what was there: dried beef, flour, a partial sack of cornmeal, some salt pork, 3 or 4 late squash from the garden that hadn't turned yet, and she started cooking. I started to say something about paying her for it, that cooking wasn't part of our arrangement, and she shook her head once flat and said, "Don't." So I didn't. She made a stew. Simple, heavy, the kind of food that's made to fill people who have been outside and cold. Cal ate 2 full bowls, which was more than I'd seen him eat in one sitting in months, and I ate most of the rest of the pot and didn't apologize for it. She sat across from us while we ate. She wasn't watching us in a concerned way. She had her own bowl and she ate it, but she was there, present in the room, and the room felt different for it. It had a different weight, or maybe it was the right weight, the weight it was supposed to have, and I'd just forgotten what that felt like. After supper, Cal showed her his drawings. He drew horses mostly, on the backs of old feed invoices, and they were good for a 6-year-old. You could tell which end was which is more than some children manage. She looked at each one carefully, asked which horse it was, asked why he'd drawn it that way, the ears pinned or the tail lifted, and he explained, and she listened. She said, "This one looks fast," about a drawing of our quarter horse gelding Peso, and Cal said, "He is. He's the fastest horse on the whole ranch," and she said, "How many horses does the whole ranch have?" And he counted on his fingers and said, 6. 7 if you count Cora's foal, but the foal's still little, and she said, 7 is a good number, and he seemed satisfied by that in a way he couldn't have explained. I sat across the room and watched them with a book I wasn't reading. The second evening she was there, she found the sewing basket. Cal had a jacket, his winter coat, the one with the sheepskin lining Elsa had ordered from the catalog 2 winters back, and the elbow on it had been worn through for most of September. I'd looked at it every morning when I helped him get it on, meaning to get to it, and I hadn't. There was a woman in town who did mending, but I hadn't gotten there either. Nora found the basket in the cabinet without asking where it was, the way people find things when they know what they're looking for. She took the jacket from the peg by the door and brought it to the lamp and sat down and started in on the elbow. Cal sat beside her drawing horses. I was across the room going over the ranch ledgers, which I'd been putting off because the numbers weren't comfortable, and looking at them directly required a steadiness I'd been short on. She sewed and he drew, and I looked at numbers, and no one said much. The lamp made the circle of light in the room, and outside it had gone dark and the night sounds came through the wall, the horses moving in the barn, something in the brush beyond the pasture fence. After a while Cal said, without looking up from his drawing, "Miss Nora, do you know how to whistle?" She said, "What kind of whistling?" He said, "The loud kind, with your fingers." She was quiet for a moment, still working the needle. Then she said, "I used to. I've probably gotten rusty." He looked up. "Mama could." She was really loud. "So I heard," she said simply. He looked at her. "Did you know my mama?" "No," she said. "But your papa told me a little, and you've told me a little, and that's how you learn about people." He thought about this. "She's in heaven," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry." He nodded. He'd heard that a lot, but she said it differently than most, without the nervous apology behind it, without the particular discomfort of people who don't know how to be near grief. She just said it the way you'd say it to someone you meant it for. "My husband is too," she said after a moment. Cal looked at her with real attention. "Was he nice?" She didn't rush the answer. He was a good man." She bit the thread. "He would have liked your horses." Cal considered whether this was sufficient and apparently decided it was. He went back to his drawing. She went back to the jacket. I went back to the ledgers, except I wasn't looking at them anymore. I was not falling in love with her. I want to be careful about this because the story sounds like it goes there quickly, and it did go there eventually, but that's not what those early weeks were. What those weeks were was something more basic than love. It was warmth, the simple animal warmth of not being alone in a cold place. I had Cal, and Cal was the whole reason I was still functioning, but a 6-year-old can't be what a man leans on. You have to be what he leans on. That's the contract. And I'd been doing that, holding myself up and holding him up too, with nothing underneath me, for 14 months. She was underneath me now, or beginning to be. Solid ground. That was all I could name it. Solid ground after a long time of finding none. She'd been there 12 days when she knocked on the barn door. Past 9 in the evening. The ranch was buttoned down, the animals settled, no good reason for me to be out there. But I'd been coming out to the barn at night for months the way some men go to the saloon, not for any purpose, just to be somewhere that wasn't the house. The barn smelled like horses and hay and lanolin and iron, and it didn't ask anything of me. It just held me in the dark and let me breathe. She knocked and opened the door in the same motion, which told me she'd been out there a moment and decided. She was in her day dress with a shawl over her shoulders, which was not enough for the night air. I could see that from the way she pulled it closer when the barn air hit her, which was colder than outside. I said, "Something wrong?" She said no. She looked around the barn the way you look at a room when you're deciding something. "I wanted to ask you something." I waited. "How long have you been sleeping out here?" I looked at her. "I don't sleep out here. The blanket on the cot in the tack room says otherwise." The blanket was from a foaling in January. I was going to say. I'd used the cot then and left the blanket. But she was looking at me with a level patience that made the lie feel like more trouble than it was worth. "Not every night," I said. "Often enough to keep a blanket there." I went back to what I'd been doing, which was checking a splice on a broken lead rope. My hands remembered the work. I'd been meaning to replace that rope for 3 weeks. Holt, she said. She'd stopped calling me Mr. Holt around day 3. Yeah. When did you last sleep a full night in your own bed? I thought about it honestly, which took longer than it should have. The answer required going back through weeks that had blurred together. February, I said finally, and then because that was a strange thing to say without context, she died in September. First few months after, I was so tired I slept without trying. Then in the spring it stopped working. I paused. Something about the spring. The light changes and it's supposed to mean something and it doesn't. Nora was quiet for a moment. The barn settled around us. One of the horses shifted in a stall. I lost my husband 4 years ago, she said. Same as yours, fever. The whole thing was 8 days. I looked at her. I didn't sleep in a barn, she said, but I slept in my sister's barn for about 6 weeks. Her husband thought I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had, but it's quieter than a house. The animals don't look at you. A small dry movement at the corner of her mouth, not the way people do. I set down the rope. People look at you like you're going to fall, I said, and you can see them calculating whether they should catch you. Yes, she said, exactly that. We stood there for a moment in the barn, the lantern between us, the night outside, and I thought about how strange it was to have someone understand that. How rare. Cal talks about Elsa, she said. Your wife. He talks about her plainly, the way children do, without ceremony. He told me she sang while she cooked. He told me she could whistle 2 fingers loud, which he's been trying to learn. I know, I said. He asks me to show him and I can't do it either, never could. She almost smiled. He told me she smelled like lavender and bread. He said he's worried he's forgetting the exact smell. My throat tightened. I knew about that. We'd had that conversation. I'd found one of Elsa's scarves in the cedar chest and I'd let him keep it, and he slept with it near his pillow, and I didn't say anything about it. He's got a good memory, I said. My voice did something I hadn't expected, so I stopped. Nora let the silence be what it was. She didn't fill it or redirect it. That was another thing about her I'd noticed. She didn't treat silence as a problem to be solved. After a while I said, he's a better boy than I know how to deserve right now. She said, most fathers feel that way. Most fathers make their sons breakfast. She didn't argue with that. She just let it sit there. Then she said, come inside. Not a command, an invitation that assumed I had the sense to take it. It's cold out here, she said. You've been out here 2 hours and you were up before light. Cal's asleep. Come inside and sleep in your own bed. I put the rope down. I turned off the lantern. I came inside. The weeks that followed, I can tell you what they looked like from the outside. A man and a woman and a boy in a house, going about the ordinary work of living in a cold season. The school days, the ranch work, suppers, evenings by the lamp, simple things. From the inside, it was something else. Something I hadn't had in so long I'd forgotten it had a name. It was being tended to. Not coddled, she wasn't that kind of woman, and I wouldn't have tolerated it if she were. But she noticed things. She noticed when the coffee was the last of what I'd ground, and she ground more without mentioning it. She noticed when Cal's boots had gotten tight, and she mentioned it to me directly, practically, the way you mention a fence that needs fixing, and I went to town the next week and got him new ones. She noticed when I came in from working the east pasture looking like something the land had half eaten, and she put a plate down in front of me without being asked and said, "Eat before you fall over," and I ate. I noticed things about her too. I noticed she graded papers at the kitchen table in the evenings with a red pen she kept behind her ear when she wasn't using it. I noticed she drank her coffee black and slightly too hot and burned her mouth regularly, and was annoyed by this every time as if it were a new occurrence. I noticed she had a habit, when she was working through something in her head, of tapping 2 fingers on the table, not anxious, just thinking, like keeping time. I noticed she laughed at things Cal said that were genuinely funny, not the performed adult laughter that children can always detect, but the real thing, which startled out of her, and which she seemed mildly surprised by. I noticed she looked tired on Fridays in a way she didn't on other days, and that by Friday evening she'd push back from the supper table and sit for a moment with her hands flat on the table, gathering herself, and then she'd be all right. I noticed I'd started watching for her to come back in the afternoons. The night it changed, or began to change, because these things don't change all at once, was the night of the first real snow. It came fast, clear at supper, a low gray ceiling by dark, and by 9 o'clock the wind had swung northwest and the snow was coming sideways, real snow, winter announcing itself. I had 2 horses in the near pasture and I had to get them in. I went out in the snow and wind and got them, Peso giving me trouble about it, which he always did, stubborn animal, and got the barn closed down and came back to the house cold through. Nora was in the kitchen. The lamp was turned high. She had my coat from beside the door over her own shoulders because the wind had been working under the door sill, and she handed me a mug when I came in without saying anything about it, just held it out, and I took it. I stood there in my wet boots and drank. My hands were cold enough that the heat of the mug was painful, and I drank it slowly while the warmth worked up my arms. "Cal's asleep," I said. "Since 8, he didn't last long tonight. We read 2 chapters of the boat story and he was gone." I nodded. I didn't move to sit down. I just stood there with the mug, and the snow came against the window, and the lamp made the kitchen warm and closed the way a room gets in a storm. She went back to her letter. She was writing to her sister in Colorado. I knew this by now. She mentioned her sister sometimes. A woman named Fern who had 3 boys and a husband who ran a dry goods store in Pueblo. I watched her write without pretending I was doing anything else. Her pen moved evenly across the page. She pushed the strand of hair back from her face without looking up. I don't know how long I stood there. The mug went empty. I didn't move. She looked up, found me looking at her. She didn't look away. She just held it level and waited to see what I'd do with the moment. "What?" she said. "Nothing." I set the mug down. "I just thank you for being here." She looked at me for a moment. Something moved across her face, quiet, too quick to name. Then she said, "You're going to be all right." Not a question, not a reassurance the way people offer reassurance when they don't believe it, something else. A statement she decided was true. "You think so?" I said. "I do." She went back to her letter. "Go to bed, Holt, you're dead on your feet." I went to bed and I slept. The mornings began to get easier after that. Not all at once, not in a straight line. Some mornings were the same as before, the weight of the house before I was ready for it, but the overall direction had shifted. Something in the mechanism had caught. I started making breakfast again. Not every morning, but most. I'd come in from the early chores and find Cal already in the kitchen and Nora already in the kitchen, and I'd start the eggs and Cal would talk about whatever he was thinking about, which was usually horses or school, sometimes both together, and Nora would listen and occasionally ask a question, and the morning would happen around us. One morning Cal decided to explain to her, very seriously, the difference in personality between each of our 6 horses, or 7 if you counted the foal. He had opinions about all of them. He thought Cora was kind but reserved, like a person who needed you to earn it. He thought Peso was basically a good horse but had a vanity problem. He thought the gray gelding I used for rough pasture work was secretly sad, though he couldn't explain why. Nora received all of this without smiling in that condescending way adults smile at children, just listening, occasionally asking follow-up questions that showed she'd retained information from the previous conversation about these horses. Cal was satisfied. He finished his eggs and went to get his things for school. I was washing the pan when she came to stand beside me at the basin. Peso has a vanity problem, she said quietly so only I heard. He does, I said. It's the main thing wrong with him. She made a small sound, not quite a laugh but close. Then she went to get her coat. That near laugh of hers, I'd started noticing when it arrived. She didn't make it often, she wasn't a woman who performed amusement, but when something actually struck her as funny, this small sound escaped her, almost against her will. I noticed I'd started doing things that might produce it. I noticed this about myself without doing much about it. It was a Saturday morning, the end of November. I remember it with that exactness because it was the first Saturday I'd come in from morning chores and made breakfast without hesitating over it, without the gap between knowing I should and doing. I'd just done it. Eggs and salt pork and bread, nothing complicated, but I'd done it and Cal ate it, and there was something in the plainness of the fact that felt like a gear catching. Small, but real. Nora had gone out to look at the pump. Something had been wrong with it, a thing I hadn't gotten to, and she'd mentioned once that she'd worked a pump before and knew what to look for. She'd gone out without asking me about it, which was her way. I was washing the pan when Cal appeared at my elbow. He'd been saying her name in unrelated sentences all week. Nora said this, Nora said that, telling me things she'd told him at school, or telling me her opinions on things she'd mentioned at supper, or just working her into sentences that didn't require her. I let it be. I understood what it meant. He put his hand on my sleeve. Papa, what? Is Miss Nora going to stay? I looked down at him. He was 6 years old and he was asking me the thing I hadn't let myself ask yet. She's got a contract through the spring, I said. I know, I mean after. I dried my hands and hung the cloth. He was looking at me with his mother's eyes, the same particular shade of gray-green, the same quality of looking further in than was comfortable. I don't know, I said. It was the truth and I gave it to him clean. He thought about it. I asked God to send you someone kind, he said. For a while now, I didn't know who. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without any drama to it, like simple information he wanted me to have. I crouched down to his level. His socks had a hole in the left toe that I was going to have to deal with. He still hadn't put his boots on this morning. I know, I said. I heard you through the door. He looked at me, then he said, do you think she is the one? I thought about the barn at night. I thought about the mug she handed me in the storm without being asked. I thought about the jacket with the elbow patched. I thought about the way she'd sat across from me in the cold lamplight and said you're going to be all right, like she'd looked at the evidence and reached a conclusion. Yeah, I said, I think she might be. He nodded slowly, processing this. The kitchen door opened and Nora came in from the yard, cold-cheeked and brushing snow off her coat sleeves, her hair slightly disordered by the wind. She looked up and found us, me crouched at Cal's level, Cal looking at her. Cal walked over to her. He reached out and took hold of the hem of her skirt, not grabbing, just the light particular grip of a small child who trusts, the way they hold on to be sure you're there, and he looked up at her. He said it quiet, almost to himself but enough that we both heard. Are you the angel Papa prayed for? Nora went still. She looked down at him and I watched the breath leave her, and then she looked up at me across the kitchen. There was something in her face I hadn't seen before, all the even patience gone, something underneath it showing through. She blinked once. She crouched down in front of him, getting level with his eyes. What makes you ask that, Cal? He thought about it with the seriousness he gave serious things. Because Papa stopped praying, he said, but I didn't. And God usually sends someone. She looked at him for a long moment. Her hand came up and touched his hair, once, gently, the way you touch something you're not certain you're allowed to touch. I'm not an angel, she said. I'm just a person, but I'm not going anywhere, all right. He considered this carefully. Then he said, okay. and let go of her skirt and went to get his boots because that was settled. She stayed crouched there a moment after he'd gone. Then she stood and looked at me. Her eyes were bright. She wasn't crying, she was not that kind of woman, but they were bright and she didn't try to hide it. "You prayed for someone," she said. "Cal prayed," I said. "I told you I stopped." "What did you stop praying for exactly?" I didn't answer right away. The question was more precise than it appeared. "I stopped believing anything was listening," I said finally. "Not in anger, just ran out of the thing you need to keep doing it." "Faith," she said. "I suppose." She was quiet a moment, the snow outside still coming. "I stopped too," she said, "after Daniel died, for nearly a year. And then one morning I was in my sister's barn, which I've mentioned, and the light came through the slats in a particular way, and I thought something stupid and simple." She paused. "That the light was still doing what it did whether I was watching or not." I looked at her. "I started again," she said, slowly, badly, with a lot of argument, the dry near laugh. "I don't know if that counts." "I think argument probably counts," I said. She almost smiled, not quite, then she said, "Holt. Yeah. I'm not an angel. I want to be clear. I'm a 41-year-old schoolteacher who can't make pie to save her life and who has a terrible temper before coffee and who slept in a barn for 6 weeks. A pause. But I'm also not leaving in the spring if there's a reason to stay. I want you to know that." I looked at her for a long moment in the flat gray morning light, which was more honest than lamplight and showed everything plainly. "That an offer?" I said. "Something close to one," she said. She stayed through the spring. The county renewed her contract and she stayed through another year after that. We didn't hurry. Neither of us had the capacity for hurrying anymore, not after what we'd both come through. The widowing does something to your sense of time, makes you careful about what you let yourself want, slower to assume. But she stayed for supper. She stayed in the boarder's room. She and Cal built something between them that didn't need me in it, which I was more grateful for than I knew how to say. She read to him at night, the long adventure stories he loved, and sometimes I'd stand in the hall and listen to her voice through the door the way I used to stand and listen to his prayers, and something about that felt like a thing being returned to me, piece by piece, without ceremony. The spring after she arrived, I found myself in the yard at dusk, after the day's work, standing at the pasture fence looking out at the land the way I hadn't let myself look at it in a long time. The light going gold on the ridge, the horses in the near pasture, Cal's voice from inside somewhere talking to the dog. I stood there and I just looked at it. I don't know if what happened next was prayer exactly. It wasn't the words, it wasn't anything formal. It was more like acknowledging something, that the light was still doing what it did, that the land was here, that Cal was inside with a good woman reading him stories, that I was still here, which had not always felt like a certain thing. She said yes in October, 2 years after she knocked on the barn door that first cold night. We were on the porch after supper, the evenings short now, the air with the first real bite in it. I said what I'd been working up to for longer than I care to admit. She looked out at the yard for a moment. Then she looked at me. "I thought you'd never ask," she said. "I was starting to think I might have to. I was working up to it." "For 6 months," she said. "8," I said. She looked at me with the expression I'd come to know, fond and exasperated in equal measure, which was more or less how she felt about me generally, and which I'd come to understand was its own kind of affection, and she said yes. Cal, who had apparently been listening through the open window, made a sound I can only describe as a 6-year-old's version of triumph. We heard his feet on the floor and then on the stairs, and then the particular creak of his bedroom door, which meant he'd gone to pray about it. Nora put her hand over her mouth, shoulders shaking. Then she put her hand down and laughed, openly, the real kind, and I took her hand in both of mine. Her hand was cold from the evening air, she always ran cold. I'd learned that, and I held on to it. The first star was out above the ridge. The land was going dark in the west. I could hear the horses in the barn. I've carried that moment a long time. The particular weight of it, her hand in mine, cold from the night. The sound of my boy upstairs talking to God about what had just happened in the yard. A man doesn't forget the moment he understands that he has been given back something he thought was gone for good. Given back not through any merit of his own, not because he earned it or arranged it or even asked for it, just given back. The way a grace comes in its own time, through a door you'd left open without knowing it. Cal had left the door open. 6 years old, kneeling by his bed in the lamplight, praying for his father because his father had forgotten how. I think about that on the quiet mornings now. When the house is still and she's asleep, and I come down early the way I've always done, and I stand at the window with the coffee. The way I used to stand there alone, looking at the yard, at the barn, at the ridge turning from black to gray to the first pale light. Now she comes down behind me. Never awake before her second cup, I've learned not to expect it. She comes and stands beside me and we look out at the same yard together, and she doesn't say anything and I don't say anything, and the silence between us is the right kind. The kind a man could live in his whole life and count himself lucky.